Hello and welcome to another episode of Everything Digital Health. I'm Marcus Bohr, I'm a GP, and today I've got with me Dr. Tom Nichols, who's another GP, and we're both keen clinical informaticians, so we're specialists in health technology, some of the cultural and technological aspects that go around data and information, particularly in general practice. But Tom, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit further?
Yeah, thank you. As you say, my core training was as a GP, but many of us now identify as something slightly different, and I'm not never quite sure how to introduce myself now. So about 9 out of 10 of my working days are spent in pressing buttons and arguing with people to make things better. And one day in 10, I still see and talk to my patients and examine them, which is a rare art that we seem to be losing in 2025.
Yeah.
So yeah, my current role, as you know, is I've worked my way through from pressing buttons in my own practice, and people would sometimes say, "Tom, what have you done?" And other times they'd say, "Wow, this is so much better. How did you do that?" Um, but gradually over time, each time I did that, I learned a little bit more about the way the systems worked, and I had a huge advantage, which was that I worked for a practice where the senior partner, Dr. Tony Randall, was one of the old guard. He developed his own system, his own electronic patient record.
Wow.
Um, his claim to
Okay.
fame was that he
Seriously,
beat,
old guard.
yeah, seriously, old guard. When I think it was RTF, or that there was an accreditation process which was put in place for the first time, and his system, he drove to wherever it was to provide his documentation, and he was accredited the day before Eggton with their new medical information system.
Ah, EMIS.
That's
Yes.
it. So
Yeah.
yeah, but that was a fantastic opportunity for me because having been somebody who'd programmed things on their BBC Micro as a child and things like that, I then had somebody who had huge authority on how to do things well, and so
Wow.
we played with the system. And although he'd moved to EMIS PCS by that point, we went from the transition from EMIS PCS to EMIS Web together, and we just developed lots of things to make use of this new system that we found in front of us. And that then led to me working for successive regional health authorities doing the same. And I suppose that the story of my informatics career is absolutely robustly writing letters of complaint saying this isn't good enough. And then someone coming back to me saying, well, you can't do any better. Yes, I can. Do you want a job then? Um, so
Oh,
that's
right.
what I've done since that.
That's an interesting wisdom piece that you've picked up. Is complain and get a job through it. Um,
I think it's partly also how you complain, isn't it? If you can see what the solution is, and the first time that you came onto my radar was that PHCSG conference that lives in my mind as a real turning point in my thinking, where you were describing what was needed in order to solve the problem. That didn't mean that you could deliver it, but you knew what the
yeah.
solution was and you could put it forward. And I think that's one of the hallmarks of informatics as a community. We aren't we aren't simply moaning about it. We're trying to figure out how to make it better.
Yeah.
And that's what such a lovely collaborative atmosphere in our nerd herd, our community of circle of people working together for the greater good.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think as GP is one of those areas where it was small enough at the start, sort of in the 90s, for people to um, decide to build their own little computer system. And no one was interfering with your ability to do that. So it meant there was a lot of fertile ground for sort of creating stuff. And because it was being created by the doctors themselves, that did introduce the kind of layer of safety and clinical knowledge that you would want to be applied to that. Because when I think when we talk about the early days of GP computing and it being a bit of a wild west, I think we might falsely give the impression that it was carnage, that lots of unsafe things were done with data. And I don't think it's quite like that because actually the safety was built in because you've got clinicians driving it.
Absolutely. The transfer of care from outside of digital into digital wasn't done overnight. It was done incrementally, step by step. And the management, you wouldn't have used the technology unless it delivered something to you.
Yeah.
which improved the way that you were working and closed a safety gap. Just medication, the idea that you can put two medications into a computer and it warns you, hang on, you're about to kill someone because you mustn't give that medicine with that medicine.
Yeah.
Um, that's sort of that's what it's delivered for us, isn't it? Some of the requirements.
I think we've got some of that. I still think there's a huge way to go in even just that example, like what we've ended up with. Because now I think GPs, in contrast to the 90s, we've completely lost control of the process. There's very little end user input that directly influences how these systems work. And so
Yeah.
what we've got is pop ups that pop up to say, you've prescribed a drug, and there's a reason why we're going to say this or this other drug, you should have a warning for it. But often those warnings are completely, they're just gibberish, they're just drivel. And so we get kind of fatigued. A lot of the pop ups that come up are either irrelevant or they're not finely attuned to the most dangerous potential interactions, and doesn't even start us on the issue of things like where those interactions are not visible to the computer because one of the medications is prescribed by the GP and the other one is an injection they're getting from rheumatology clinic, and that level of stuff we've solved really everything that can be solved inside a general practice, I think. But where we're really struggling is where secondary care has not really stepped up and got itself the good systems, really. I mean, they still can't do repeat prescribing in secondary care.
It's a question of digital maturity, as far as I'm concerned. We've been on this transformative journey for coming up with 50 years now, and many of those things have been cracked. But secondary care is embarking on that digital journey. And I think the one of the things I'll talk about today is how do we move forward with that. Um,
Yeah,
for me, there are two big things. One is what are we actually trying to achieve, and how do we coalesce around something that makes sense to everybody? Because there are lots of forces pulling in different directions. So that's one area that I'm going to spend my career focusing on. The other is feedback, and the learned helplessness culture that has evolved in general practice is now such that when you get those prescribing alerts and the overload of gibberish, why do you get that? Well, you get that because it hasn't been designed to meet the core aims. Plus, there's no effective feedback mechanism by
absolutely.
which you
Yeah,
can say, this is nonsense. And that feedback cycle of this is nonsense and fixing it, there's so many steps in that chain, and such a wide absolution of responsibility. Absolution is the wrong word. Um, the responsibility, there's bug passing. So, for example, a nice case in point, I don't know whether you saw the flucloxacillin and high severity warning a few months ago.
I don't think I saw that. No.
So, flucloxacillin being a commonly prescribed antibiotic for skin infections and things like that, one of the manufacturers of flucloxacillin had reviewed the clinical safety of the drug and decided that there was a potential risk that giving flucloxacillin, and I think it was a commonly used painkiller, cocodamol, there was some tenuous theoretical risk that if you took flucloxacillin and cocodamol together, under some rare circumstances with some undiagnosed conditions, the patient might suffer harm or something along those lines. So the manufacturer had then stated they advised that you should never co-prescribe this commonly prescribed antibiotic and this commonly prescribed painkiller.
Okay.
So of all the manufacturers that make the drug, it took one to absolve themselves of that responsibility and say, we don't recommend you do this. And then every practice in the country was receiving a high severity warning, a red triangle, you know, stop, don't prescribe these together.
Yeah.
So that's sort of surfaces the total nonsense of how buck passing and poor system design can result in some nonsense. And it has now gone, but I wonder just how much disruption and confusion that caused, and how many patients were told, oh, you must stop your painkillers while you're taking this antibiotic in the meantime for that to happen. And I place money that there were tens of thousands of confused and irritated GPs
Yeah,
who had no mechanism to say this is nonsense. They didn't bother because they knew if they did report it, that nobody was going to do anything about it. And
it's
so
very
what
hard.
do they do? They get trained to just dismiss the safety alert. So then we get into a culture of dismissing safety alerts because they're not. So this whole feedback loop, as
Yeah,
we're violently agreeing,
very.
is something which is very difficult.
I think it's exactly that. It's a trained helplessness rather than learned helplessness because I think it's imposed externally. Um, I once tried to get a clinical safety issue fixed in TPP System 1.
Hmm.
This was about 10 years ago now. But I had noticed that if you type in the prescribing box, so in the free text bit of your prescribing box, possibly the most dangerous part of any health system ever, they had decided to have some autocomplete garbage going on. So what happens if you typed some text and then space, dash, space, and then some more text, it would replace that dash with the word or. Now, that's not a standard thing. I don't think people do use dash to mean or. They might use a slash to mean or in common parlance, as it were, but it's not predictable to the average person that that would be a candidate for an autocomplete. And System 1 just does that without telling you.
Hmm.
You can disable that feature, I think, but it's enabled by default. And there's a whole load of other things, some quite maddening and some very dangerous that it does by default. So what happens is you type in, give this medication as instructed by the pediatric clinic, and but then it changes the dash in the middle to or as instructed by the pediatric clinic, causing immediate confusion because now the parent, this was a child prescribing case, the parents came back and said, well, what does it mean? Give it this way or as instructed by the pediatric clinic. And I had a look and
Mm.
it was like, no, I meant give it like this because that's what's instructed by the pediatric clinic. Long story short, I reported that. I was told, you're doing it wrong. I reported
User
it,
error, huh?
yeah. And I said, no, it's completely illogical that that autocomplete should be there, that that auto replace should take a dash and turn it into the word, or it completely changes the meaning of what was written. It's not helpful. It's absolutely terrifying. And even at the time, the clinical or medical director at TPP said, well, it's been like that for ages and no one else has complained. And I was thinking, well, of course, people don't complain because
Right.
they've been taught that when you do complain, you get told
Nothing
you did it
happens.
wrong, you're an
Yeah.
idiot, you obviously don't know what you're doing with your prescribing box, Mr. GP. And so you can easily find that you are the only person who's complained, uh, but you probably
That
have.
doesn't mean that you're wrong.
Doesn't mean that you're wrong, no.
Yes.
So in the end, that got escalated through to NHS Digital, and it was
Yes.
fixed within 2 weeks.
And that's so, yes, it illustrates all sorts of things that could be so vastly improved in all of these systems. And what you're describing is one very specific clinical safety hole that nobody had spotted before,
Yeah.
and articulating it as somebody from a position of relative authority. Were you a trained CSO at that point?
I wasn't a CSO, but I was the chair of the health informatics group.
I
So,
see.
like, you know the people that you need to contact. I mean,
Yes.
for anybody who didn't have RCGP HIG,
Mm.
BMA contacts and didn't know the TPP medical director and have his email address,
Mm.
you wouldn't have got anywhere. You would have been forced to go to the unhelpful desk at your local, whatever were calling them at the time, now an ICB or something like that, CSU. They would be unhelpful, which is their
Mm.
job,
Mm.
and they would manage your complaint in as few words as possible to de-escalate it and get it off their page, get it off
Mm.
their list. You know,
I've been in two minds about the emergence of the ambient voice technologies and the other AIs which are really hitting the ground and being promoted in a substantial way, and the application of the clinical safety standard, the DCBO 160, this
Mm.
monolith of how to safely do things, and the notion that every general practice should be completing a formal framework assessment of how they how they use their systems in their own practice, and thinking it's nonsense, the idea that you would expect every practice to do it. And yet there's another reflective part of me which thinks about the clinical safety training that I received and how it's affected me as a clinician in my ability to take the thing which is driving me nuts that I can see is going wrong, not necessarily in my care or my system, but when I receive a letter from the hospital accusing me of not making the right referral, and I say, but your form is designed to stop me giving that information. But that whole mentality of how do you articulate as a clinician why what you're saying is a problem in a way, in a language that can be understood and standardized, so that when you hand that over to a system supplier, you're articulate and they get it immediately. And so part of me is feeling like some of the clinical safety training that we do for digital clinical safety officers isn't actually such a bad thing to be being implemented in general practice to improve
Mm.
our culture and effectiveness. So I'm rather torn because I know that that wouldn't happen overnight, and yet I can also see some value of it, and particularly given that we're going to face new tooling on a regular basis, and the pace of change is going to be very high.
Yeah, I think more widespread clinical safety training for clinicians is probably a good thing. As you say, it gives us a little bit more of an articulate way of describing a problem, but we could probably get just as much impact. I'm not saying don't do that, but I'm saying as well. We need to be gathering the these reports of a clinical safety issue nationally,
Yes,
and they need to be in an open platform where daylight
can shine.
can
Yeah,
shine on all these problems, and we can see where the clinical safety issues are.
yeah.
And I know that any system suppliers will immediately recoil in horror, thinking, "Oh my God, people are going to read
Going to be able to tell us
the
what's actually wrong and how dangerous it is.
people are going to read this, and it's going to have commercial implications." And I'm like, "Damn right, it's going to have commercial implications."
Yes,
The idea that we should be sheltering any system supplier in order to not cause commercial upset is a kind of weird one, isn't it, when you think about it? So we've got two camps essentially that could be harmed here. It's either patients could be harmed because there's a clinical safety issue, small camp in the middle, clinicians could be harmed because they could be falsely blamed for something the system buggered up, or the suppliers could be harmed. And it's clear that the NHS has decided to side with suppliers and bollocks to the patients. Because if we really cared about this, we would have an open registry of every clinical safety issue that's ever been reported on any clinical system. And that doesn't mean that just because a clinician reports something, that it's true, but it means that that becomes now a point that has to be discussed. And I'll give you the par excellence example of why this works and why it's necessary. If you look at how vulnerabilities are described and discussed in the tech world, they have exactly this. They have an open registry of every vulnerability or exploit that's out there. And they have this concept called responsible disclosure as well, which is where you give the manufacturer 3 months to fix it, after which it goes on the open registry that's public of all the vulnerabilities that affect. So, for example, if there's like a bug in internet in the Edge browser, for example, you would report that to Microsoft first and give them an opportunity to fix it before you publish it. But the crucial thing is the fact that it's going to be published means they have to get on and fix it, because otherwise there'll be an explanation of the vulnerability will be public,
it'll be exposed.
but
Yeah,
the browser vulnerability hasn't been fixed. And so that is why we've got actually a fairly responsible approach to fixing these kind of things in the rest of the tech world. We need that for healthcare. We need that so that you can publish it. But not only do we get that kind of benefit of the daylight as the best disinfectant, as the quote goes, it also means that clinicians aren't left to be like, oh, you're the only one who's ever reported this issue, because you can see that it has been reported, and there's
Mm.
another 50 clinicians on the forum, for example, all agreeing that
Yeah.
there is an issue here. And that means now you're not on your own. It also helps the suppliers, I think, because firstly, you can get corroboration that this isn't just in the imagination of one GP. This is several people agreeing on it. But also, you can prioritize, because I think if you've got, you could simply say, right, well, the more people that complain on a particular issue, the more likely we are to fix it.
And I think some of the clinical safety work really hangs it in a very good way, because the process of identifying what's the difference between the hazard itself and the causes that lead to that hazard and the way that those create effects to get there, it makes the issue far more objective. You can typically find a good form of words to describe the problem, and the value judgments that get ascribed tend to come in on what's the severity of the problem and what's the likelihood of that problem becoming manifest. And that's an area where you can start by agreeing what the problem is, and any disagreement about what is the severity, what's the likelihood, if there is disagreement between parties about how to calibrate those things, you gather evidence.
Yeah,
And that approach, by making this an objective and evidential basis, it stops the conflict. And oh no, it doesn't stop it manages the conflict. So what I'd really like to see, in the same way as you, I'm sure I'm violently agreeing with you, is the things that we've discussed previously about the need for a digital clinical safety repository and
yeah.
tooling that connects these things. I'm aware that I believe the GP contract 1st of October included a contractual requirement for every practice to register with the Learning from Patient Safety Events system,
Hmm.
which is interesting because I'm not sure how that's going to. It'll be interesting to see how it lands. The I haven't yet experienced that system myself, but it is a national system, and when we've fed quality concerns, safety concerns through to regional level, the ICBs and whichever incumbent regional authority have had the responsibility to synthesize those and put them into the LFPSE space. But this may actually be an opportunity for some of the cultural change, for the fact that we can speak up, and a mechanism for doing so. I will watch with great interest to see whether or not it's
Yeah,
actually effective
that
or not.
that'll be interesting. I have heard rumblings of some kind of system coming down the tracks,
Mm.
and I heard of something called PSIRF,
Hmm.
PSURF they tend to call it, um, and don't really know much about it. I would I would like for it to be successful. I think it would be great if we do have some kind of national reporting system for um, technical and computing things, but also for all the other things that can go wrong. And rather than them being datixed in a trust and then just disappeared, um, they need to be collated nationally. There needs to be
Yeah.
resources behind this. So I would like a team of people that are constantly scouring that list, looking
Mm.
for the most worrying potential issues, um, the the most dangerous ones, are the most frequently reported ones. So I mean, there's
Yeah.
two kinds. They can be sort of minor things that are reported all the time that just waste people's time, and then
Yes.
there's like extremely dangerous things where someone could die
Yes.
or many people could die. We have to be sort of talent spotting for those kind of reports and managing them nationally. Um, and key to that means actually resources to manage them nationally. Because what tends to happen is 50 different trusts or 50 different GPs will report the same problem. Each of them will have been told, oh, you're doing it wrong for the first 6 months. And then you manage to get it escalated. But then the solutions always end up being an email from NHS England which says contact your local ICB and renegotiate a contract so that just making you the solution, it's not helpful. We have a national health service. Act
Mm,
like it. You know, get straight from the. If you've got a phone call from someone very senior in NHS England as a supplier saying this needs to be fixed and the deadline to fix it is this date in 6 weeks' time. If it's not fixed, we will punish you through your contract. There has to be mechanisms for doing that, but
mm.
unfortunately, just way too much sort of light touch. Too much Stockholm syndrome with suppliers, which is definitely a thing within the way that GPIT is handled, and just not enough trusting that the GPs or the clinicians involved in reporting these things are right. We know what we're doing with healthcare.
All of the above. But I would also add that when in my regional role, one of my roles was, in fact, at the Health Informatics Group, our responsibility in many ways is to advocate for the GP who is a GP and not an informatician.
Yeah,
And problems get presented to me where I think I know what they're actually saying, but the form of words that they've used to describe it means that I can't be sure. And so part of the crowdsourcing model of centralizing this is to allow a system whereby an ordinary clinician can just go duh, and put that inarticulate expression into a space,
yeah,
but that there's the potential for somebody else to recognize, oh, I've got that problem too, even though it's been articulated in very, very plain or non-informatics language, such that over the course of time, what seems like one GP having a moan can actually grow and increment as more people identify it, and the articulation of that problem becomes more honed, such that the next grumpy GP who puts it into the system is directed to contribute towards that.
yeah,
It's something to do with the coalescing of
yeah.
fermenting the problem into what's actually going on.
I
So
mean,
that's what I'd like to see.
look, what we're describing is a forum. It's not even that hard to arrive at a solution here. I'll put
Yeah.
it out there that if there's anyone from NHS England or any other body worldwide that wants to do this properly, it's relatively simple to do. I'll even do it for you. You commission me to build you a forum, and we go for radical openness, which is going to be scary because everybody, including patients, is going to be able to see the systems and the problems that exist within these systems. You're going to need to be a national body because you're going to need the top cover, because suppliers will try and sue you into silence about talking about their systems. Um, but that's just a pain that we're going to have to go through and change the culture, because once you've done that, we are then able to have open conversations, and as you say, somebody can have a problem that they find. They could search that forum and they'll find, oh, it's already been described. So all I need to do is say, yes, +1, I have found the same thing today. So you don't even have to re-describe it, which is, again, I'm very much against anything that wastes the time of anybody. And I think
Yeah.
having 50 people report the same problem in long form is a waste of time. I'd like one person to do a really good description of it, and then the other 49 people to go, yeah, that I had that too.
Yeah.
And that can be used to prioritize. But like, it's completely doable right now with existing technology. You don't need to build a custom platform. You don't need
Mm.
Accenture. You don't need any of the other big players to create you a custom anything. You just need a forum, and you put,
And for people to communicate.
yeah,
It is that simple. WhatsApp is changing the delivery of issues like this in primary care. And if you have a new project that you're going live with, the people are setting up a WhatsApp group so that everybody can instant message and have a moan. But actually, you've got your clinical safety officer as part of that group, and so people are voting with their feet, aren't they, to try and bypass the official channels and set up systems that you can just use in order to contribute to the dialogue.
yeah. So what in architecture they have this phrase called paving the desire path, which is where
Yes.
so if people are using WhatsApp to discuss the clinical safety implications of a go live with a project, then we
Yes.
should pave that path and we should say, you don't need WhatsApp anymore. We will create you the single place where everybody can see these things, and you've got a shared space. And we do need to provide the protection as well that goes with it. So if an individual clinician reports an issue and the supplier takes the view that that is libelous or in some way defamatory of the system, then the legal protection needs to swing into action to say, no, actually, supplier, your problem is not with the individual clinician; it's with us. We will provide you, a concrete umbrella, as it were, that will keep the those any risk of that from landing on an individual, because this is how you suppress dissent. You go after the individuals,
Yes.
and governments do this as well as corporations. But interestingly, the pharmaceutical industry isn't even allowed to do this. So we've managed to get the pharmaceutical industry into line,
Mm.
culturally and legally.
Mm.
So if you are, for example, a researcher and you publish a paper that says drug X kills babies,
Mm.
they cannot sue you. They cannot come after you when that pharmaceutical company has its shares plummeting out through the floor.
Mm.
Even though they really want to, they are not allowed to pursue a researcher for highlighting a clinical safety issue with a drug, but they absolutely can, if they are a software supplier, pursue an individual for pointing out a clinical safety issue with software. And so we haven't managed to even maintain parity with what we used to have in pharmaceuticals. There's a few different like areas where that statement's true actually, but in this clinical safety reporting, we've taken our eye off the ball as a profession, and we now have a worse situation.
So, is this something where we would ask for leadership from the BMA to identify that among the many liability issues which remain landed on general practice, this is yet another liability issue that is preventing the software from moving on, and ask them to bring in their whistleblowing policies? There must be whistleblowing experts who are there to systematize how you protect people's right to speak up. We have right to speak up champions in various different settings, don't we? But perhaps because this isn't just primary care software, it's actually all of health software across the entire estate. We can discuss that with the BMA and just say, how
Well,
about building this into
it would
your
be
whistleblower policies?
amazing if anybody was prepared to take a role in this, sort of lead from the front. It it does need to be big organisations that have stature and a little bit of legal backing, um, so that there is a feeling that you will be protected if you do speak up about systems.
Mm.
Um, and I think if it was done sensitively, and actually, I'm not anti-supplier here. I think we bring suppliers along with us and say,
Mm.
this is how we're going to transition to this new, more open approach. That's going to be good for you in the long run, but there's going to be short-term pain. There's going to be lots and lots of reports of clinical issues. Some of them are going to be, user error, PEBCAC, problem exists between keyboard and chair, which I love. And, some of them are going to be user error. But then, in amongst that, there's going to be really important things that need to be fixed. There's another aspect to this, which is that if an issue exists in one type of clinical system, it's very likely that that issue probably exists in some other systems as well, but we're still sort of forced into playing whack-a-mole with them. So, for example, the example I gave earlier about the hyphen being auto-corrected, well, that's TPP have taken that one feature out, but it probably exists somewhere else in some other part of the NHS, in some other system, and
Mm.
that the users of that are also exposed to that risk. No one is fixing it for them in a systematized way. Yet, as your example points out, we do have a systematized way for fixing this for drugs. You don't have to go around every single manufacturer if a drug needs to be withdrawn. It's just withdrawn.
Mhm.
That's we have systematized ways of doing it for other types of problem, but not software.
As you describe that, I'm thinking about the trajectory to where we got here, and I'm wondering whether or not the timing is ripe for something. Just to recap, if we go back 25 years, there was the first good practice guidelines for primary care electronic patient records were commissioned by the then NHS executive, I think it was, rather than the department. But over the course of the past 25 years, periodically, governmental bodies have invested in working with the RCGP and our clinical informatics group to upgrade the description and the articulation of what makes good record systems and what makes good practice in the way that you use those systems. Um, I noticed that the work on shared care records, which is entirely relevant to single patient records, from 2009, which was commissioned by RCGP, it's been taken off the RCGP website, and I realised that there's been a 5-year effort that you started in order to have that restored, which I'm going to pick up and run with. But we've there has been work on how to do this systematically and the professional voice in all of this. Um, as we move towards the single patient record, one of the cornerstones, one of the foundational pieces of work for any single patient record, including all the systems that might contribute to it, includes exactly these sort of systematized ideas. And so it may be that the system level requirement to have effective feedback mechanisms, cross organizational, cross sector registers of clinical safety, and identifying the standards that need to apply to all of them. Whatever happens with a single patient record, how quickly it gets here, those would be foundational pieces of work. And so it may be that we can land those things. I'm going to try very hard to persuade RCGP that it needs to put itself forwards and say, DHSC, if you want a single patient record to happen, we wrote the rule book on
Yeah,
how to design GP records. We were paid by previous governments to write the rule book on how to design single patient records. Let's just keep working on this. So that's something I'm working on.
I think that's very laudable aim. I think that's what we should. That's how it
Thank
should
you.
work. Um, Previous chairs of the RCGP Health Informatics Group managed to get that in place,
Mm,
and then it sort of stopped happening. The the RCGP, I would like to, I would like to believe that it's something that that we could use as GPs to get system change, but its internal structure seems to have got a bit arcane and unpredictable.
mm,
Um, as the Royal College of GP Health Informatics Group chair, I had access to a grand total of zero resources, zero funding, zero additional capabilities that came with that role. And if I wanted to get anything done, I had to convince a person that worked inside the college, who's not a GP, who works as a sort of normal salaried administrator type person within the college. I had to convince
mm,
them of my case. And if they wanted to get something done of significance, because usually they don't have any purse strings either, they had to go and convince council, who is GPs. So I am a GP, clinical informatician, clinical safety officer. I have to convince essentially a layperson of my point, which is often complicated, and then get that layperson to go to council or whatever is the power structure. And long story short, that just never results in any action whatsoever.
mm.
So they have designed themselves into being a completely ineffectual organization, and until they change their culture, they can't move forward. That's my. It's. I know that that's quite rude, but it's true in my head. I'm willing to take some criticism and some pushback on that. Let's see what the comments.
In the first instance, I'd like to respond by thanking you once again for the passion that you brought to bringing that to the table. Because actually, a couple of years on, there have been some really important inroads that have been made into that domain. And as you know from the recent report that I wrote to the college on what's happening, we've still got a long way to go.
Hmm.
But the the record that the health informatics group is now depositing incrementally, step by step, within the forum that you set up for us, we're starting to build up the most enormous head of steam of organizational memory and threaded dialogue to explore what the issues are, so that when they resurface later, actually we've got a fighting chance of picking them up. So the continuity of the narrative is starting to be built. The the consequence of moving the health informatics group from a relatively small closed community to a much wider open community, inclusive, not
Hmm.
limited to people who are expert in digitization, but ordinary GPs who just need to solve their problem digitally. We've grown from 50 to I think it's around 80. And so
Cool.
the awareness and the transparency of the group is improving. Just moving on from that technical implementation, we've got the remunerative framework for the chair and the deputy chair for a number of funded sessions in a way that was never the case in the past. We've got frequent meetings with the honorary secretary who is listening and wants to help. So we've got several things which are all moving in the right direction. And there are some things in the pipeline which I'm optimistic about. Um, I haven't had my optimism burnt out of me with learned
Well, that's
helplessness
good to
just
hear.
yet in this role. So yes, I think periodically, with those governmental initiatives, the single patient record idea coming up repeatedly, there's been an investment cycle, some development work done by college, which has then been dropped because the political atmosphere has changed. And on the back of that, we have some excellent systems like electronic prescribing and GP to GP, which came out of those bits of work. So I'm hoping that now will be another phase of investment in the professional voice, and we can do another cycle of what we need to do to lay the cornerstones to have better systems, whether that's a single patient record or a simulated single patient record, etc.
Yeah, it does. It does certainly feel like it's a very important time. If the single patient record is something that's been talked about for years, and if it's going to actually happen, then we do need clinicians of all kinds to be right at the front of designing that safely, and of course we need patients to be also right at the front of that to make sure that we're um, building something that does the things that they need it to and addresses their concerns about confidentiality and privacy and abuse of the record. Because one of the things which I've said in multiple previous episodes of this, that um, if you give the government access to your medical record, then the government will access your medical record, and they don't necessarily distinguish between what they think of legitimate uses of that. So they might well think it's fine to, for example, use your medical record to determine whether you're an asylum seeker, or uh, depending on,
Or a criminal.
yeah, or a criminal, yes. And of course the definition of criminal is always something that can change. So it's not currently a criminal offence to have a sexual orientation that is not heterosexual, but you only have to imagine what the next government could do. So I always think, don't think about what government you've got now, but just let's assume the next government is going to be ultra fascist,
Mm.
just as a thought experiment. Not
Yes.
because not because we're expecting that to happen, of course, but let's say, uh, as a thought experiment, you assume the next government is going to be um, extremely sort of
Authoritarian.
1984 authoritarian government. And so you have to design your systems with the assumption that if you give somebody access to a record, they will abuse it. And so that doesn't mean don't do a single patient record. It means design it in a way that prevents that abuse,
Mm.
or makes it transparent, for example, so that if you could see who accesses your record across the whole NHS, then any unauthorized accesses would be really obvious, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's something that Sam Smith from Med Confidential talks about all the time. We keep getting promised that the NHS app will show us who's accessed our medical record, and it never happens.
Yep. And those promises have been refreshed recently. So it's a very nice segue onto some things I thought that I could bring to the table to discuss with you.
Cool. Yeah.
And I've got a little bit of visual material to present as well to hang some of that on. Um, I've got an anecdote which I think may speak to something very important in 2025, which is why I decided to become a GP. Because the application of my reflection on that decision is actually pivotal in describing something slightly counterintuitive about what I'm up to now. So I trained up in Newcastle, and in my final year, I did an attachment at the coronary care unit.
Hmm.
And as a final year student, I was there for, I think, a month or something along those lines. So what would happen? I was experienced by then at taking a history, examining people, analysing their ECGs, etc., etc. So within the first week, I had seen so many chest pains and presented those cases back to the middle grade doctors who were running the unit that I started to get the hang of it. And by the end of 4 weeks, I was operating at a very comparable level to a junior doctor in terms of taking history, examining, drawing the conclusions, considering the plan.
Yeah.
I was able to write up the drug chart and get the practice of what that would be like and hand it over to the doctors who were qualified in order for them to check what I'd done, approve it. And for the first time in 5 years, I actually felt like I was useful, that I wasn't simply learning and soaking up the precious time from the people I was working with who were, trying to get on with a busy job and also trying to train me. And I didn't feel guilty. I felt useful. I got the huge buzz of, I'm close to being a doctor now.
Yeah.
So from
Cool.
that really good experience, I then went into general practice. And I think at the time my heart sank because as a hospital doctor, you have this notion that general practice is all about coughs and colds and sprained ankles, and nobody practices any serious medicine out there, and
Mm.
all of these cultural stereotypes. So I sat there and I listened, and patient after patient came in, and the GP was engaged and chatty, and next patient was arriving, and he said, "Oh, you'll like this lady. She's very jolly hockey sticks." That was his semantic for her, because of course, this was that was a thing, right? Playing hockey. The girls, boys did football and cricket. The girls did hockey.
Hmm.
So she was an old lady. But he explained how he'd known her and her husband before they married, and when they did marry, he delivered their first two children, and
Wow.
how a couple of years before he'd buried her husband, and so he gave me just a sense of the fact that this wasn't just another patient coming in. So anyway,
Mm.
she arrived and they exchanged pleasantries, and I think she brought some jam or something for him. But they then got down to business, and she said, "Oh, I just had this terrible indigestion all weekend," and I watched his body language, and his smile faded, and he said something like, "All right, let her talk." And she then started to describe how, it hadn't been, she hadn't felt quite right since then, and she didn't feel herself, and she had no energy. She's a bit breathless,
Mm.
and I'm watching him,
Yeah.
and I'm watching her, and I'm watching him nodding and keeping her talking, but I can see in his body language that he's taking it more and more seriously. And I'm there looking at this thinking, she might have had a heart attack. He does know she might have had a heart attack, right? He's not an incompetent GP, right? And then him gradually asking the questions, has there anything else been going on? And her ankles had swollen up, and I'm like, game, set, and match. Okay, so she's had an MI and is now going to heart failure. But watching the way that he changed his body language, he changed his questioning, and delicately said, I think this could be quite serious.
Mm.
And seeing her go white, actually, I think this could be your heart. Actually, I think you need to go to hospital for this. No, actually, you can't go home. I'm going to call an ambulance for you now. And suddenly, this wasn't the next 69-year-old chest pain. This was a real person. And in the real world, having a heart attack and going to hospital is a very, very scary thing.
Yeah,
And I suddenly had this. I was snapped from the protocol-driven, faceless next chest pain, yes, next chest pain, very highly skilled work of streaming people in an algorithmic way, which I'd taken a real buzz out of, and I instantly wanted to become a GP because I would realize that I was far more interested in the people and the humans than I
yeah,
was in delivering highly effective, efficient, modernized, protocol driven, evidence based,
yeah.
monotonous clinical practice.
That's a very interesting story. I think that probably will resonate with lots of people who have become GPs. I think lots of I recognise the thing about feeling useful, and maybe in your early part of your career, it's appealing. The idea that the protocol-driven nature of certain types of medicine means that you can get to that stage of like, I know what to do, I know what to do. But then yes, I think putting that in the human context, in the end, really that's the bit that only a human can do, because we are now in an era in which we're being presented with computerized systems that can certainly digest inputs, and they can process them, and they can give you an output. I'm talking about sort of AI driven LLM sort of things. And on occasion, they can make a diagnosis, and even some rare diagnoses. I've heard stories of people who've put a series of weird symptoms that their child has into ChatGPT, and it says, I think your child might have this strange syndrome." And of course, that's a rarity, uh,
Mm.
and of course, it's very prone to error. But let's imagine that as systems get better, we can engineer a lot better healthcare by using a machine-assisted human, but you'll still have to have a human there to sense check the outputs. And you'll still have to have a human there to get the inputs, because a lot of this is about examining people and stuff. Um, and most of all, you have to have a human there to contextualize it and make it to sort of explain it to a patient and make sure that like um, in your example, your GP knows this person very well, knows how to get the information from them, and also knows how to explain it in a sensitive way that isn't going to have the patient break down in tears, and is also going to make the patient go to hospital because they need to go to hospital. There's all of that skill set.
So I think the next part of that story is when that patient comes out of hospital, he's going to see that person and read their discharge summary, and he's going to think about what to do with them and support them through the rest of their journey, whichever path that takes, whether that's actually recovery or whether it's on the way down and burying them. So there's something very important about the reason why we became GPs in the first place, which is making it very difficult for us to get on board with some of the other agendas. I've got some slides that I want to hinge what I say next on. I've been trying to work out what is it that the medical profession needs to bring to the table at this point. And there's a recurring theme, which is that people who want primary care data don't seem to understand that it's not there for them. In the first instance, the reason people come and see us and the reason we document things is to provide our direct care.
Yeah, yeah, that's the success story of general practice IT. In fact, where other similar enterprises across the NHS haven't quite worked as well,
Mm,
and but it's very difficult to get people to take on board the lesson, which is that if you engineer a very good user interface, that when you're using it for the delivery of direct care, you incorporate some good quality data into that entry,
yeah.
then the downstream effect of that is all of the great health data. So you can do audits, you can search for patients, you can do population health management, you can do research. Uh,
Yeah.
but the upstream, the key thing you have to do differently is you have to make sure that the user interface is really slick and allows the clinician to record what they're doing really nicely. And GP systems did that very well because they were designed mostly by
By
GPs.
GPs.
Hospital systems do not have this, and so they still don't code their records. They still can't do a repeat prescription. Um, all of that user interface stuff means that they don't have quality data. Coding in hospitals is done by an army of clinical coders who use ICD 10 or 11 to get paid. The coding does not go to the granular level of what actually happened within each clinical encounter, and secondary care clinicians are not used to coding at that level. General practice is, and that's why we have this good data.
Well, I think it, it it wouldn't bring me into conflict with anybody unless they felt entitled to those data and they wanted those data and picked a bone with me because they couldn't get them or that they weren't good enough quality. And I've got the Greek text from the Hippocratic Oath, um, which I'll leave on screen while we chat. There's
Yeah.
some research papers that have been published within the past couple of years that indicate that about 70% of the current medical schools in the UK are still asking their junior doctors to swear the Hippocratic Oath at the point of qualifying, which is more than I thought it would be, actually, given the very archaic language and so on. But if you talk to the public, you find that 86% of the patients still believe that we all swear the Hippocratic Oath. So we're not doing it as much, but everyone thinks we're doing it. But one of the things which upset me and demoralized me was that the, when you do the before and afters, um, how much do you trust people? How much do you trust your doctor? How much do you trust in confidentiality? That's been a topic that's been surveyed repeatedly over the years. But there's been a 20% fall in overall confidence of the general public that their data are confidential since the beginning of the pandemic.
Wow. Yeah. And yet nothing's changed in medicine. I think we still approach the medical record as though it is confidential
Yes.
as clinicians, and but I think downstream of us there are people who haven't declared the Hippocratic Oath,
Yes.
who have got more and more power over larger and larger amounts of medical data.
That nobody made them swear to acknowledge that medical records were holy secrets, and if you messed up, you would lose your reputation forever. And that's one of the key things that clinicians, doctors, have to bring to the table, because we've spent millennia trying to tell everyone about confidentiality and the acknowledgement of its importance, and it's fragile.
Yeah.
Do you recognize this?
Well, I recognise a lot of med confidential stuff. I've had Sam on the channel before.
Mm.
Um,
This is a screenshot
yes.
of a Facebook post, and this. I took this earlier on today. At the top, it's got a partly false, reviewed by third-party fact checkers thing, which Facebook had generated because this was uh, a harmful post in some ways. But the lessons that we can learn from it are very, very powerful. So somebody posted in response to the GPDPR program, by which our primary care data was going to be used for secondary uses. And the components of this are the finality of, once it's taken, it will never be deleted. There was a date, opt out by the 23rd of June, which didn't specify the year, and it was retweeted and it was liked and it was shared and it did the rounds on social media, and this is the consequence. So what we're looking at here is data from the national data opt-out tables,
Wow.
So until you get to that point in summer 2021, there were around 2.5% of the population who had applied the national data opt-out. The the GPDPR plan launches, and nothing really happens until you get to that Facebook post. And suddenly, within weeks, the national data opt-out had doubled. So it went up to 5.3%. And so that single Facebook post doubled the national data opt-out rate. So you then skip forward to the following year, the paper Data Saves Lives, a white paper from the government is published saying we're going to have to do something about the opt-out system because the opt-out system is too confusing for people and it's broken, and therefore we should try and fix it.
Mm-hmm.
But the damage had been done, and it sort of plateaued. You can see it. Nothing changed after that. So the next lozenge I've got on there, which is the orange social media echo, summer 2024, no, April 2024, that Facebook post did the rounds again. And because it didn't have have the year on it, nobody could understand that this was not contemporaneous, and that the GDPR thing, that was years ago, and there is no GPDPR. They axed the program because it hadn't been handled in the best way. But suddenly, the data opt-out rate takes another little surge
Yeah. Well,
from an echo.
I was the chair of the RCGP HIG right through that period, and I can remember what was happening. So, the earliest I heard about GP data for planning and research was in about 2018, 2019, before I was chair, and they came to us very earnestly saying, we've learned the lesson of care.data, which launched and failed in 2013, I think. It was a catastrophic self-own by NHS England. They just had no idea what they were doing. But they decided that they were going to learn those lessons, and they were going to be really careful to make sure that they would step forward very piecemeal and slowly with GP data for planning and research, and that they would think about things very carefully. They would have a roadmap that would be approved by the profession and by patients, and that they wouldn't cause any further opt-out. They would bring everyone along on the journey. And they did that for the first bit. And then as soon as it started to get what you might call attention from inside government, they were pushed into going faster and faster and faster. And we were saying, we're the profession, we're the people who you said you would bring along gently with this project. And we're saying you need to slow down here, mainly because they hadn't decided, even at that stage, what data was going to be taken out. So it's very difficult to give professional approval for something that is not fully
Not fully defined.
fully defined yet.
Yes.
But that's not a problem for certain people working within this sector. In fact, I suspect that a lot of people who probably shouldn't be working in this sector actually thrive on the ambiguity. So when it is not clear what data is being taken out, that's the situation they're trying to get to.
Absolutely.
They don't want it to be defined because
Yes.
that limits their
It gives
future
wiggle room.
options. Yeah.
Yeah,
And so
absolutely.
we were saying, no, we're not going to sign up to something when the contract is still unprinted. There has to be something clear. But despite that, it was pushed and it was pushed. Then there were dates suggested for when it would go live, and we were saying that's too soon. If you want to genuinely learn the lessons of care data, listen to us this time, because you didn't listen to us last time. It fell on its face. Anyway,
Yes.
they accelerated and accelerated, and they achieved complete escape velocity and smashed themselves into a brick wall. And I suspect, they're kind of doing the same thing again with the federated data platform, but over a sort of slower period, longer period. I think they probably will have a similar problem with the single patient record as well, because unless it's done very carefully, they will just end up creating enough worry within patients that there'll be attempts to to opt out. Now, of course, opting out of a direct care record is in itself, it's firstly not possible, and secondly,
Yes.
it's sort of illogical. But the fact that people will want to is an indicator that we're possibly doing it wrong. We have to think
Well,
about the trust model, and that's still not, it's still not sorted.
absolutely. And I think in terms of taking those lessons learned and operationalizing them, the conclusion that I can draw, and the real point of that slide isn't so much how uh, system failures, although that's a good lesson to learn. The key thing for me is, after 7,000 years of building confidentiality, one Facebook post was enough. And so it the the benchmark for what we have to aim is, it's not whether the systems are confidential or not. It's not whether the systems do offer cybersecurity, etc., etc. What determines people's behavior and whether they come and see their doctor at all, what they tell us, what we record, is the perception of confidentiality. It's the belief that it will be confidential. Because if we don't think that it's going to be confidential, we don't write it down. Or it's there, but we put it in free text and we don't codify that information.
Mm.
Patients literally won't come and see us. And so this is a statement that I've been trying to find the best form of words. I think it's generally true that the committee and the RCGP and BMA are for the use of general practice data, very carefully using the word use rather than sharing. In the
Yeah.
context of things like the open safely approach, where the data don't leave the source system, it's possible to use the data for many of the things that you might want to without ever sharing it. But
Yes.
coming back to my overall point, clinicians, I'm very often, if I'm the only medical informatician in the room, I may be the only person who's lived and breathed what it means to see somebody dropping cues in the consultation that I was trained to pick up on, that actually they want to say something that's a bit sensitive, and finding a way to let them know that it's okay to talk about those things, and the vital importance of confidentiality in terms of delivering care. Unless you've lived and breathed it and sat in those secret rooms and heard people's secrets, despite the fact that they're uncomfortable sharing them, you won't get it. And so, as medical informaticians, it's our job to fly the flag of why perception of confidentiality is important.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think if patients don't feel that their medical records are still confidential, if they think that bits of it is going to leak back to the government or the DWP or whoever it is that they're worried about, then they'll stop coming to us,
Yeah.
and you'll know that that's happening because when enough people are worried about it, there'll be a business model for a GP who uses only paper and
Yes.
is a private service, and the premium, the unique selling point that you're paying for, will
Yes.
be, we don't have a computer in the practice. You can come in here, we will give you medical care, but you will nothing from this consultation can leak into this ocean of data which is being collected about you across the NHS.
And in some ways, sadly, we're actually already there, because it's entirely possible to register additionally with a private medical practice, and every city, I would have thought, has one. So that if you have the money to, and you want confidentiality and you don't trust the NHS systems, you can pay to get it. So if we end up in that situation, we'll worsen health equity, and in defiance
Yeah.
of the core principles of the NHS.
And one thing we absolutely must refuse is any notion that the use of the NHS is only free if you agree to data pay.
Yes.
Because I think certain governments have been sniffing around the area of this a little too closely for my liking. So there's been definite suggestions that, the line of logic goes, well, we know from Gartner reports that the value of the data in the NHS is X number of billions. Now, of course, they'd have to make up X number of trillions because a trillion
Yes.
is now the unit of big money.
Yes.
whereas billions before were enough.
Used to be.
So it's worth, and then make up a number with lots of zeros at the end, and then you say, in order to maximize the value of that, we have to make it as easy as possible for the life sciences industry to maximize the data value, AI, blah, 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 blah.
Mm.
And so all users of the NHS can essentially donating their data. There's no opt out. It's part of what we do for the greater good. And I think that's really toxic. Um, Absolutely reject that wholesale.
Well, well. So I'm going to put a caveat on that,
Uh huh.
um, because there may be different ways to conceptualize it, which are eminently more palatable. So I'm going to bring the discussion into the strategic space. I've got
Okay.
on screen a pie chart, which is from 2008. The Institute for Healthcare Improvement is based in the US, but I'm just going to walk you through the narrative of how it developed and why I'm going to try and use the modeling that they've done in order to advance the professional dialogue with this. So the triple aim: look after the population, make them healthy. It's sometimes miserable accessing health, and you get referred and you never hear what's happening, etc. You don't know where your records are. The dissatisfaction with repeating yourself over and over again, blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
So all of those were thrown into this model, including the fact that rationing is inevitable because there is no health system that has unlimited resource. And so whether we use the ugly term rationing or the more palatable term managing costs, ultimately you can't run a health service without managing the costs. So this comes along and people think about it and they talk about it and it gains traction. There's an academic paper that I've put the link to there. But fairly soon afterwards, 20 years, um, what you get is a paper called The Phantom Limb. I've forgotten the name of the American who invented this. And I know he was 15 years later. So in 2013, he describes the fact that if you just focus on the triple aims, the consequence of that is you're prioritizing everybody else's needs, but not the needs of the workforce. And therefore, the quality of what it's like to work as a professional in this space is being neglected to the detriment of being able to deliver everything else because your workforce is struggling. So then what happens that's relevant to the UK is that in 2018, 5 years later, the Parliamentary Review of Health and Social Care comes along and they identify that this is something that they want to build in. So that they endorse the quadruple aim, which is then written up in a formal paper and publicised in various different pieces of work, like the 2019 paper that I've got there. And off the back of that, the Welsh BMA reps said to the BMA, look, this is so obvious that the profession should be endorsing this, that the BMA form a policy and they publicise it in 2019 saying we endorse the quadruple aims for health and care. So that's a landmark because it sets out the professional's overarching aims for how to deliver a health service. So we get there, and then after the pandemic, there's an update which they've published a couple of years ago, which hasn't yet been adopted by the BMA. Obviously, in order to change the constitution, you have to go through a whole series of processes and put it to the votes of the members, etc. So they haven't adopted the quintuple aim, which brings in advancing health equity. It's a nice, concise phrase, but it's a no-brainer to understand that actually that's a core goal for them. So where that gets me to now is we've got to get people to coalesce. And I think the quintuple aims is the best idea that I can adhere to.
Mm-hmm.
The politicians necessarily can't do anything if they don't get votes. So they must take things which are visible to patients, that they experience, that gives them a sign that they're not getting what they want, and respond to that. And the thing which comes up over and over again is waiting lists, waiting lists, waiting lists. And the latest one is appointments, appointments, appointments. And what it's the it's superficial.
Yeah,
That's my concern. It's a metric, it's measurable, it's observable, but the age old thing of you're measuring what's measurable, not what's important, those metrics are not necessarily the most helpful thing. And what we're very used to in the technical space is that somebody has a shiny new toy and it sounds great. And people, the average person interacts with life in our society as a consumer. We're used to going and buying something, and we've got marketing that tells us what's good and entices us in. And sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But we have a consumer mentality, and what we're what we buy into is seeing something that looks like it's going to solve our problems. And
yeah,
so you get a solution being sold, and then you have loosely formed problems that you know are issues, but you don't necessarily have a solution for. And so you jump on it. And very quickly, in the deliverable atmosphere of we've got to do something in before the next general election, or we've got to do something in the next year because with the budgetary constraints are tied with the fiscal year. But these external constraints mean that solutionizing, bring the solution being presented, they're instantly grabbed on. And so when I think about the use of artificial intelligence in clinical practice or the single patient record, they have the hallmarks to me of a solution without a problem. And so what I'm going to be at pains to do is to try and track. It's sometimes referred to as the golden thread, the
hmm
key. What are we actually trying to achieve? What is our aim? And how does that aim connect through to the things that will help us meet that aim, from which you can derive the requirements that your solution is actually going to deliver on. So I can't stop the consumer mentality. It's impossible. So when something comes along like ambient voice technology, it's a losing battle. So I'm not going to try and fight that one. What I am going to do is try and take the quintuple aims and see if I can drag, kicking and screaming, the requirements which those solutions are claiming to be able to address or believed to be able to address, and try and bring them back to why. Why do you want a single patient record? You're saying you don't want the patient to have to repeat themselves. Why?
mm,
Why do you not? Okay, this is about the patient experience. Fine. We've got a connection through right the way from there. So if this is about patient experience, although that's what many people say about the IT systems, is that the most important thing that contributes towards patient experience? Or by buying into this solution because it seems like it's going to deliver on something, are we actually putting our time and energy and funding into something which isn't necessarily improving the patient experience? And when you do that, are you propagating the health equity bias of the digitally literate people who can access that? Because if you just go straight for that, then you create a system that's not designed to meet the workforce's needs or advance health equity. And so I want to build those reflective cognitive layers over many years because this is not
interesting.
going to
Yeah,
be quick.
I, I think you're right that governments do not create new ideas in a way, and there's a lot of stagnation of ideas. That's really just exemplified by the fact that we've spent 25 years going around the same circuit in healthcare technology.
Mm,
We haven't really made much advance, and governments just grab whatever's lying around,
mm,
and they thrust that into the Overton window of what's acceptable to do. Um, but the real innovation comes outside of government, and that's where the ideas are generated.
mm,
Um, I'm very, you're right to unpick the reasoning behind, say, a single patient record. What's the line of logic? Where are we coming from in order to justify the need for this thing? And I think, in particular, I've said it before. I'm very skeptical about the argument of you won't have to repeat yourself. I think that is dangerous health tech populism being peddled by our own health secretary. Um, the idea that you will never have to repeat yourself is really dangerous because we use repetition as clinical practitioners in
to
order
validate.
to
Whether you've been
validate.
told Chinese whispers.
So when I see a patient, even if I have
Yes.
the perfect record in front of me,
Yes.
I will still talk to them. It's
Mm.
part of establishing a rapport. It's
Mm.
part of working out what they're here for. Because
Mm.
just because they have 5 problems that are expertly detailed in the record, I don't know what problem you've come for. So I certainly want to. I have to get you to repeat some bits. We want to know if we're going to remove a kidney. We would like to just check with you several dozen times that we're removing the correct kidney. And you're going to have to repeat yourself, and it will get tedious. But we do
Yes.
that for safety reasons.
Yep.
We want to make sure we've got the right patient for the right thing. I mean, we've all had the experience of somebody who's turned up in a GP surgery and they are the wrong John Smith, and somebody has linked their appointment with the wrong John Smith. If you just trust the system, you will now put a consultation about the wrong patient in the wrong patient's notes. But one of the ways that we find out that we've made that mistake is we say, "Oh, hi, what are you here for?" And they'll say, "Oh, it's my eczema," and you'll say, "Oh, we don't have any eczema in your record here." If we just trusted the records completely and we didn't ever let you repeat yourself, we would make all kinds of medical mistakes all the time. So absolutely, when somebody tells you that a system is there so that you don't have to repeat yourself, I am immediately thinking, you are a charlatan. The only reason that we would want
Challenge.
good systems is I don't want to have to repeat your MRI scan that you had 3 weeks ago in this
Yes.
in my hospital because I can't get hold of the MRI scan imaging from the other hospital.
Yes.
That's the kind of
Yes.
repetition that wastes time, money, effort, etc. That is already a solved problem, but we don't need a single patient record for that. We need a vendor neutral national archive.
How about this? If you tease this apart
Okay.
from the superficial patient experience of being annoyed by having to repeat yourself, buried underneath that is actually a really good informatic idea. So Emma Lads, who presented to us at the Primary Healthcare Specialist Group,
Yeah.
some of the ideas were from a paper that she wrote with Trish Greenhalgh, and they were talking about the different types of continuity. And I've really bought into some of the things that they're articulating there. There are different types of continuity. If we were to take what they describe as, I think it's the episode of care continuity issue, within everything that we offer, there is something which the technology should deliver by way of carrying the information payload of the episode of care within everything else and stream those data in a collected way so that the effort that we put in curating it, for example, you see a patient, they tell you a story, you think, I'm concerned about this. I want you to be seen by the hospital to have this particular test. So as GPs, one of our expertise roles is that we look at the data that are available to us and we curate it. We synthesize it. We form the clinical narrative of the hypothetico-deductive model that we've arrived at. And at that point of handover, we create a clinical referral information bundle. There's a narrative that goes with it. There's factual information about the medicines, the problems, the investigations that have already been done, the treatments that have already been, and we curate a bundle. Variable degrees of skill, variable degrees of effort. If you're busy, you're just not going to do the job as well. Variable degrees of technical support to allow us to do that effectively. But we then hand that over and we try and lob it at the secondary care provider, who then picks it up and will do their. But the systems have never been designed to support us doing that really well and to carry that payload through the stream of the interfaces in a way that can be used for maximum effect later. And part of that is, at what point does the patient validating, no, you've written 3 months. It wasn't 3 months. I said 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Of course, ambient voice technology may or may not make that better. Who knows? But the contribution of the patient workforce that we've never tapped into, if the fundamental strategic aim is to improve the patient experience and to deliver effective care by having continuity of episode of care or problem orientated information transferring through the system. Now you're talking my language. I don't believe that a single patient record would do that. That would be a byproduct, but one of the requirements, if you were going to build a single patient record, would be to allow those data to be sticky and follow themselves through. And so the superficial could actually become something really fundamental if it's thought through properly by primary care informaticians who are trained to think that way, and supported by the academic world who are thinking about these things and studying the past 150 years of general practice and what's the value proposition of a GP in the system in 2025, like those academic colleagues are. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm
The,
very stimulated by
it,
um,
it's a very
these
interesting
possibilities.
area, and I think what worries me is leaving it to be solved by um, ministerial commandment, because I think when "make me a single patient record" echoes down the hallway of Whitehall, and then it gets into NHS England or the Department of Health and Social Care, it'll get done, but it might not actually make the situation better. And they'll be able to say, "Yeah, look, we did make a single patient record, but did we actually improve your care? Um, we don't know."
And that's why it's important that we actually approach this from a position of mutual respect. It's very annoying that politicians are politically driven because their agenda is different to ours. And yet, we've got to work with them. And at the same time, the BMA, they've got to work with the BMA. And so, to understand what's in the heart of the profession, looking for after the workforce, advancing health equity, actually caring about population health, which is not a political aim. The general public, they may be horrified when they realise that cancer rates in other countries are worse, but it doesn't change what they do.
Mm.
You said we're champions of population health in a way that politicians aren't necessarily. That's not their core aim. But if we go for something like the quintuple aims, we can get everybody around the table and agree, yes, those are 5 good aims. And if we could just get that far, we
I
might be able to bring people kicking and screaming together. I have had some success with doing precisely that in
I
some of the
like the
initiatives.
idea, certainly. I mean, I certainly the idea of having some agreed aims, and everybody
Mm,
around the table can say that we've agreed that those are the important aims of our organisation or whatever it is. But I think the the point where I find it harder to believe is that everybody's got a different idea of how to achieve the aims, and often
yeah,
they're pulling in opposite directions, and I think sometimes there are things that we won't even consider as part of the solution. So, for example, as far as I'm aware, and let's see if anyone can prove me wrong here. There has been no discussion worldwide about the difference between copyright and patent as regards software. So,
mm,
in healthcare, what this means is that there'll never be a digital generic because copyright lasts so long. So we're used to the model of pharmaceuticals, and you have a therapeutic element, some drug, and it's patented, and then it becomes generic, and the costs drop. So I'm aiming in one of your quintuple aims, which is controlling the costs.
mm,
Now, we've got an assumption that that's just what happens, but that is what happens in patented goods. And it doesn't apply to software. So if we've got digital therapeutics, which is a word that you hear more and more now, people are trying to produce proprietary systems that essentially are aimed at delivering some kind of health outcome, like
mm,
I've got an app that will help you sleep. Okay, we're assuming, for no good reason, that
mm,
they will eventually be generic, but they won't. They will
mm,
never be generic.
mm.
So but there's a whole episode I need to record on this. But
Yes,
but the point being, who's having that conversation? Because that's for governments to have. That's for the profession to have.
but that's this is a perfect example of something that's missing
Hmm.
between where we are scrabbling away trying to do things, and the overarching aims that actually we all agree on, you you're you're aligning to using our resources effectively,
Yeah,
and you've got an insight which needs to be captured and
yeah,
put into its place in a way that people can either accept or reject. But by and large, I don't think you'll find people that violently agree with you, except the people who are making money off it.
I think what I think is a really interesting thing here is a lot of the stuff that I talk about could be referred to as how it addresses one or more of the quintuple aims. I
Mm.
certainly think that's a good way of describing it, um, in a way that immediately brings it into relevance. So it's not just waffling on about something, it actually
Mm.
has material impact on one of the quintuple aims. So
Mm.
that is why you should listen to it. That is why it has importance.
Yes.
Certainly think that's an interesting insight and one that I will take forward, because certainly, you know, anything you can do, any way that I can describe ideas in a way that maximizes their impact is better. You know,
That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a common lingo, a lexicon that can bring people together on this. And the experience that I've had over the past, I don't know, 18 months or so of deploying that as a mechanism to get stakeholders to focus on what's really important. And I've seen the effects of doing that in the work that we're doing on the proxy access standard, where NHS England have been tasked with improving the access of one person to another person's record in a legitimate way. And you can imagine the consumer mindset, the deliverable mindset. You can forgive them for starting from the position of thinking that the metric that they're going to measure is that you will have more proxies after the standard comes along, because that's what you're aiming for. But by hanging it on these strategic aims, it's been relatively easy to get everybody in the room to say that's not an important metric. That if you were to measure that and that improved, how does that improve the health of the population? How does that improve patient experience? It doesn't. And so, actually, the whole fundamental premise of what you're trying to achieve, if you dwell in that space before you move on, it stops you from having to unpick things later. And when you're challenged and somebody comes along and says, "Oh no, 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 no," and raises new issues, you either bring it back and think, "Yeah, we haven't mapped that correctly. We didn't ever capture the drivers and the requirements correctly. Let's go back and change those." Or you're in a position where actually you can justify it and say, "Here are your concerns. Overall, it's been felt that it's better to do it that way because by serving this particular requirement, that's overall more strategic than that one particular narrative that's going on here." So I've enjoyed using it, and I've had some limited success in the things that we're doing so far. So I will continue to bang the drum for this, both at BMA, who and RCGP for that matter, that I'd like to buy into the quintuple aims or produce a justification as to why they wouldn't, and also DHSC. Anytime there's an opportunity in the new world where NHS England is winding down, and DHSC are becoming increasingly more vocal, communicating with us, having meetings with us, to just keep asking the question why until they realise that it's about delivery rather than approaching the aims, and we can pick that dialogue up. So that's
yeah, that sounds like
that's
a
what I'm
good way,
what I'm
a
going to
good
try
way.
and do.
That sounds like a good way to approach it. I certainly, I think it's good to have that common language framework to be able to describe it, and it's widely accepted as these are things that we value,
Mm.
and so yeah, it's a good thought framework. Um, so yeah, I think thank you for bringing that to the show. Um, I think if we
Time will
possibly
tell whether it was ever effective.
we what I'd like to do is sort of bring it to a close now,
Yeah.
and maybe if you can talk for a couple of minutes just about where you see the next steps of the future with the I think what you talked about, the health informatics group, and how you will use that influence to change the narrative over the next few years.
I think we will look back and see this as a huge turning point, because the technology that's available to us to do the job better is just taking leaps and bounds forwards, and that we're challenged because we've known that this was coming, but not exactly what it would look like. And now is the time for us to embrace the technology. We have no choice. We will be given the technology, and we will have to use it. And so the call really is for the profession to galvanize around something, some process by which we can ensure that the professional voice is heard, and that we don't lose our seat at the table when it comes to the description of what we need, and how we get it.
Good things to be thinking about as we go forward, really. So, well, thank you, Tom, for coming on the show. And this is a very long episode, but we've managed to cover quite a range of subjects. And I'd love to have you back on again. I, I, I think we only, there's so much to cover in clinical safety, which, I mean, we spent a big chunk talking about that, but there are many other aspects of that I think we could delve into. Um, but thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next one.
A pleasure. Thank you.